Hi there. Tonight we tiptoe into the hushed, often veiled world of Victorian womanhood, exploring a topic that was rarely, if ever, spoken of directly. Imagine yourself a young Victorian lady, perhaps in your late teens, on the cusp of marriage. You are surrounded by layers of corsetry and crinoline, your demeanor carefully composed, your conversations polite and proper. Yet deep inside you carry a profound lack of understanding about the very act that will define much of your adult life. What would you, this young woman, truly know about sex? The answer for many was astonishingly little. You might be marrying a man you barely knew, entering into an intimacy about which you were entirely, even willfully, ignorant. You probably wouldn't survive your wedding night without a severe case of blushes, if not outright shock. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do feel free to post where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself immersed in a society where the prevailing ideal for young women was purity, innocence, and ignorance. From the moment you were a little girl, you would be carefully shielded from any information deemed unsuitable for your delicate sensibilities. This meant avoiding anything that might hint at the realities of the body, reproduction, or sexual intimacy. Conversations would be carefully steered away from potentially awkward topics, books censored, and interactions with the opposite sex strictly chaperoned. The ideal woman was seen as a pure, unblemished vessel, unsullied by carnal knowledge until her wedding night, when her husband would supposedly enlighten her. Imagine your education. While you might be skilled in needlework, drawing, playing the piano, and perhaps a few languages, subjects like biology or anatomy that might touch upon human reproduction were conspicuously absent or presented in the most abstract, desexualized terms possible. Your body, beyond its outward appearance, was largely a mystery. The concept was that a woman's virtue, her most prized possession, lay in her innocence. To know too much, or even to think about such matters, was considered morally corrupting and unfeminine. This mainstream historical fact, the pervasive societal enforcement of female sexual ignorance as a hallmark of purity, was a defining characteristic of Victorian upbringing for girls. Historians still argue whether this enforced ignorance was primarily a deliberate tool of patriarchal control, ensuring female submission and naivety, or if it was genuinely believed to be the best way to protect women's innocence and moral character in a complex world. It's a bit like trying to keep a butterfly from ever touching the ground. It might stay pristine, but it will never truly know flight. You might find yourself feeling a quiet, almost unsettling curiosity about the mysteries of adulthood, perhaps fueled by whispered rumors or veiled illusions from older married women, but you would never dare to ask direct questions for fear of appearing unchaste or fast. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some very strict parents would even cover up statues or paintings depicting nudity in their homes when young women were present, lest their delicate sensibilities be offended or, worse, awakened. Imagine having a nude sculpture of Venus quickly draped in a shawl whenever guests arrived. The quiet blankness regarding anything sexual meant that a young woman's mind, when it came to her own body and its future functions, was often a clean slate filled more with vague anxieties and romantic fantasies than with any concrete understanding. This deliberate cultivation of ignorance ensured that the wedding night for many would be a startling and bewildering introduction to the realities of marriage. Given the pervasive ideal of purity and the deliberate shielding of young women, the most common, albeit indirect, source of information about sex came from the very women closest to them. This brings us to mother-daughter conversations. Evasive, vague warnings. Imagine you, a young Victorian girl approaching puberty or the cusp of marriage. Your mother might approach you, her voice hushed, her gaze averted, to impart some form of knowledge about the changes occurring in your body or the duties of a wife, but always through a dense fog of euphemism and moralistic warnings. You see, direct anatomical explanations of sex or reproduction were considered utterly improper and shocking for a young woman's ears. Instead, mothers typically spoke in highly generalized terms about the duties of a wife, the sacredness of the marriage bed, or the mysteries of womanhood. These conversations often focused more on the moral responsibilities of purity, modesty, and obedience, and the importance of producing children rather than the physical act itself. The onset of menstruation might be described as the monthly indisposition or the curse, with little to no biological explanation, only instructions on how to manage it discreetly. This mainstream historical fact, the reliance on euphemistic, morally laden and often fear-inducing conversations between mothers and daughters regarding sex and reproduction, left young women largely ignorant of biological realities. Historians still argue whether mothers' evasiveness was primarily due to their own lack of knowledge and discomfort with the topic, or if it was a conscious effort to uphold the societal ideal of purity by keeping their daughters innocent for as long as possible. It's a bit like trying to teach someone to swim by only talking about the dangers of drowning, never actually getting in the water. You might instill caution, but not competence. You might listen intently, trying to piece together meaning from your mother's uncomfortable silences and the vague warnings about what happens after the wedding, leaving you more anxious than informed. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some mothers would give their daughters small, discreet books wrapped in plain brown paper, containing veiled references to conjugal duties and the importance of female submission in marriage, but still utterly devoid of explicit biological detail. Imagine being handed a secret manual for life's most intimate act, only to find it reads like a moral philosophy textbook. The quiet awkwardness of these conversations, the unspoken truths that hung heavy in the air, meant that young women were often left to draw their own, frequently inaccurate, conclusions from fragmented hints and societal whispers. This education served to instill a sense of duty and fear rather than genuine understanding, ensuring that even within the privacy of their own homes, knowledge about sex remained shrouded in mystery and moralistic apprehension. Formal instruction about sex, when it existed at all, for young Victorian women was largely devoid of biological detail and heavily laden with moralistic pronouncements. This brings us to sex education, limited and moralistic. Imagine yourself in a classroom, perhaps at a finishing school, where the curriculum carefully skirts around any topic that might be considered remotely suggestive. The focus is on decorum, piety, and the skills deemed necessary for a proper wife, with any mention of the physical realities of marriage handled with extreme caution and euphemism. You see, direct sex education, as we understand it today, was virtually non-existent for young women in the Victorian era, particularly those from the middle and upper classes. What little instruction they received was often integrated into religious or moral lessons, emphasizing the sanctity of marriage and the importance of female purity and submission. Any discussion of reproduction was typically framed as a woman's sacred duty to bear children, with little to no explanation of the biological processes involved. Even basic anatomy and physiology were often omitted from girls' education, deemed inappropriate for their delicate sensibilities. This mainstream historical fact, the absence of direct, biologically accurate sex education for young women, and its replacement with moralistic instruction, perpetuated a cycle of ignorance and fear. Historians still argue whether this lack of formal sex education was primarily a reflection of genuine societal prudishness, or if it was also a deliberate attempt to control female sexuality by keeping women uninformed and dependent on their husbands for all knowledge about such matters. It's a bit like teaching someone to drive a car without ever showing them the engine. They might learn to steer, but they'll have no idea how it actually works. You might find yourself learning about the duties of the marriage bed from a stern teacher, but with no understanding of what those duties actually entailed, leaving you more confused and anxious than enlightened. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some girls' schools even had rules forbidding the reading of novels, fearing that they might contain suggestive content that could corrupt young minds, highlighting the extreme measures taken to protect female innocence. Imagine being denied access to Jane Austen for fear of learning something untoward. The quiet absence of factual information, the emphasis on moralistic pronouncements and veiled allusions, meant that young women were often left to piece together their understanding of sex from unreliable sources, whispered rumors, coded language, and their own often limited imaginations. This lack of accurate knowledge contributed to a climate of fear, anxiety, and potential shock on the wedding night, perpetuating a cycle of misinformation and control. Beyond the absence of direct verbal instruction, the very way young Victorian women were expected to carry and present themselves reinforced a deep-seated disconnect from their own bodies. This brings us to modesty and physical concealment. Imagine you, a young woman, meticulously dressing each morning, layering chemises, corsets, petticoats, and gowns. Every garment, every gesture was designed to conceal the natural contours of your body, to obscure its very form, and to project an image of demureness and purity. You see, Victorian society placed an extreme emphasis on female modesty. The female body, especially after puberty, was considered something to be hidden, almost shameful in its natural state. Clothing was designed to obscure the figure, and even the ankles were often considered too scandalous to reveal. This obsession with concealment extended beyond attire to posture and movement. Women were expected to sit and stand in demure ways, to avoid anything that might draw attention to their physical forms or suggest immodesty. Public displays of physical affection, even between married couples, were unheard of. This mainstream historical fact, the pervasive societal enforcement of extreme modesty and physical concealment, contributed significantly to a young woman's lack of awareness and comfort with her own body. Historians still argue whether this extreme modesty was primarily a reflection of genuine moral piety, or if it was also a form of social control that limited women's physical freedom and reinforced their perceived weakness. It's a bit like wrapping a beautifully shaped present in so many layers of paper and ribbon that you can't even tell what's inside. It might be elegantly presented, but its true nature is completely obscured. You might find yourself constantly aware of your posture, your hands, your feet, ensuring every movement was graceful and discreet, always conscious of avoiding any hint of impropriety. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian women even adopted limb-hiding furniture, like skirted piano legs, believing that even inanimate objects could be too suggestive if they resembled human forms. Imagine designing your furniture to be as chaste as possible. The quiet, constant effort of physical self-effacement, of treating your own body as something to be hidden and demure, meant that young women were conditioned to disconnect from their physical selves. This further exacerbated their ignorance about their own anatomy and reproductive functions, leaving them ill-prepared for the intimate realities of marriage. The body itself became a source of mystery and something almost shameful, further complicating any nascent understanding of sexuality. The pervasive modesty and physical concealment of young women were often underpinned by the prevailing medical and scientific opinions of the day, which reinforced notions of female passivity and fragility. This brings us to medical views on Female sexuality. Imagine stepping into a doctor's office, perhaps for a vague ailment like nerves or fatigue. You would encounter a male physician whose understanding of your body, particularly its reproductive and sexual aspects, was filtered through a lens of Victorian morality and often flawed scientific theory. You see, mainstream medical consensus in the Victorian era largely denied or downplayed the existence of female sexual desire. Women were typically portrayed as inherently less sexual than men, their primary function being reproduction, not pleasure. Medical texts often describe the female body in relation to its reproductive organs, with other aspects of female physiology, sometimes being seen through the lens of potential illness or weakness related to menstruation, pregnancy, or childbirth. Conditions like hysteria were widely diagnosed, often attributed to a woman's unruly uterus or emotional instability, rather than underlying physical or psychological causes. This mainstream historical fact, the prevailing medical opinion that female sexuality was passive and primarily reproductive, reinforced the societal ideal of purity and contributed to women's ignorance about their own bodies and desires. Historians still argue whether these medical views were primarily a genuine, if misguided, attempt at scientific understanding, or if they served to legitimize and reinforce existing patriarchal social structures that sought to control female autonomy and sexuality. It's a bit like a doctor prescribing fresh air for a broken leg. It might seem benign, but it completely misses the actual problem. You might find yourself being told that your nervousness was due to your delicate constitution, or that certain thoughts were unfeminine and detrimental to your health, internalizing a belief that your own body was prone to mysterious ailments linked to your gender. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some male physicians genuinely believed that excessive intellectual activity or education for women could divert energy from their reproductive organs, potentially making them infertile or unsexing them. Imagine being advised that reading too many books could prevent you from having children. The quiet authority of these medical pronouncements, often delivered by men in positions of power, left young women with a fragmented and often distorted understanding of their own physiology. This perpetuated the idea that female sexuality was a hidden, dangerous, or even non-existent force, further contributing to their ignorance about the physical realities they would face in marriage. The medical establishment, therefore, played a crucial role in shaping and enforcing the veil of silence around female sexuality. Beyond the broad strokes of medical opinion, a woman's body presented its own specific, often bewildering mysteries, particularly concerning a regular, natural process. This brings us to menstruation, misunderstood and feared. Imagine you, a young Victorian girl, experiencing your first period. With no open conversations, no accurate biological explanations, and surrounded by euphemisms and vague warnings, this fundamental bodily change would likely arrive as a bewildering, perhaps even frightening event. You see, menstruation was rarely, if ever, discussed openly in Victorian society. It was considered the curse, the monthly indisposition, or unwell, terms that hinted at something negative or debilitating rather than a normal physiological function. Girls were typically given very little, if any, advanced knowledge about it, leading to shock and confusion. The biological process was often shrouded in mystery, and the emphasis was placed on managing it discreetly and ensuring it didn't interfere with a woman's duties. Moreover, many prevalent medical theories linked menstruation to a woman's overall nervous disposition and vulnerability, suggesting that during this time she was particularly fragile, emotional, and prone to illness. This mainstream historical fact, the pervasive misunderstanding and stigmatization of menstruation, contributed significantly to a young woman's discomfort and ignorance about her own body. Historians still argue whether the secrecy surrounding Menstruation was primarily a result of societal prudishness about female bodily functions, or if it also served to reinforce the notion of female fragility and susceptibility to illness, thereby limiting women's public roles. It's a bit like describing a natural spring as a leaky, inconvenient puddle. The language itself shapes perception. You might be told to rest more during your period, to avoid strenuous activity, or even to avoid cold baths, all without understanding the underlying biological reasons, simply internalizing that this was a time of weakness and unavoidable discomfort. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian medical texts actually advised against bathing or washing one's hair during menstruation, believing it could lead to severe illness or even shock the system. Imagine having to go days without washing your hair simply because of a common bodily function. The quiet shame, the constant need for concealment, and the sheer lack of accurate information meant that menstruation, a natural and essential part of a woman's life, became yet another source of mystery and apprehension, further obscuring her understanding of her own reproductive system and its connection to the larger, unspoken realities of sex. This continuous lack of clear, factual information built a profound sense of ignorance from the earliest signs of female maturity. While menstruation remained a mysterious, almost fearful aspect of a young woman's life, the ultimate purpose of her reproductive system, the creation of new life, was something she would encounter more directly, though still often through a veil of practical necessity and hushed urgency. This brings us to childbirth, dread, and practicality. Imagine you, a young Victorian woman, observing a neighbor in labor or witnessing the arrival of a new infant in your own family. The sounds, the tension, and the visible aftermath would convey a powerful, if terrifying, understanding of reproduction, far more immediate than any whispered euphemism. You see, for most Victorian women, childbirth was a terrifyingly real, often public, and deeply perilous event. Unlike today, where birth often occurs in sterile hospitals, it typically took place at home, attended by a midwife, female relatives, and perhaps a local doctor if complications arose. The screams, the prolonged agony, and the very real risk of death for both mother and child were impossible to fully conceal, even from unmarried daughters in the same household. While explicit anatomical details were never discussed, the physical struggle and the eventual arrival of a tiny, fragile human being provided an undeniable, if frightening, lesson in the practical realities of reproduction. This mainstream historical fact, the home-based, perilous nature of Victorian childbirth, offered young women a raw, experiential education about the physical demands of creating life. Historians still argue whether the commonality of witnessing childbirth at home led to a greater sense of female solidarity and practical knowledge, or if it primarily instilled a deep-seated dread of the marital bed and its inevitable consequences. It's a bit like watching a scary movie. You know it's not real, but the fear still lingers. You might find yourself assisting with small tasks, fetching water or linens, feeling a mixture of profound awe at the new life and a chilling terror at the risks involved. The quiet understanding among women, the shared knowledge of this ultimate female ordeal, would be a powerful, unspoken bond. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some very strict parents would send their unmarried daughters away to stay with relatives when a birth was imminent, attempting to shield them from the sights and sounds of childbirth and preserve their innocence, a gesture often futile given the sheer scale of the event. Imagine being abruptly shipped off to your aunt's house, only to return and find a new baby mysteriously present, fueling even more bewildered speculation. The quiet terror, the practical preparations, and the undeniable outcome of childbirth offered a visceral, if indirect, form of sex education that no amount of prudishness could entirely obscure, connecting the abstract notion of duty directly to the profound physical act of bringing life into the world. Beyond the visceral realities of childbirth, the profound lack of explicit knowledge about sex was reinforced by constant, insidious warnings about the dire consequences of female impropriety. This brings us to the relentless warning against falling, reputation's importance. Imagine you, a young Victorian woman, constantly hearing veiled stories or direct admonitions about girls who lost their way, who fell from grace, or whose reputations were ruined. These were not just cautionary tales, they were stark reminders of the immense social ruin awaiting any deviation from the path of purity. You see, for a Victorian woman, her reputation was arguably her most valuable asset, far more important than wealth or talent. Any hint of impropriety, any perceived sexual transgression, even just a private, unchaperoned meeting with a man, could lead to social ostracism, making her unmarriageable and condemning her to a life of shame and poverty. The term fallen woman was used to describe those who had engaged in premarital sex or prostitution, and their fate was often dire, facing societal condemnation and limited options for rehabilitation. These warnings, delivered subtly by mothers, governesses, or through cautionary tales in moralistic literature, instilled a profound fear of sexual misstep, far more powerful than any direct biological education. This mainstream historical fact, the extreme social penalty for female sexual transgression, was a primary mechanism for controlling young women's behavior and enforcing their perceived ignorance. Historians still argue whether the severity of these warnings primarily served to protect women from exploitation in a society with few safeguards, or if they were a cruel tool of social control that stifled female autonomy and imposed a crushing burden of fear. It's a bit like guarding a treasure with a dragon. The treasure might be safe, but the guardian is terrifying and unforgiving. You might find yourself constantly self-policing your every action, every glance, every word, terrified of giving the slightest impression of being fast or forward, knowing the slightest misstep could irrevocably destroy your future. Here's a quirky tidbit. To avoid even the appearance of impropriety, young ladies were sometimes advised against reading certain novels or attending particular plays, as yash, these might corrupt their minds and make them think improper thoughts that could lead to a fall. Imagine a novel being deemed a gateway drug to moral ruin. The quiet, pervasive fear of falling, the understanding that your entire future hinged on maintaining an unblemished reputation, meant that any nascent curiosity about sex was quickly stifled by the overwhelming weight of social consequences. This relentless emphasis on purity, enforced by the threat of utter social destruction, ensured that real knowledge remained an untouchable, dangerous secret. While the middle and upper classes enforced ignorance through strict chaperonage and dire warnings, the harsh realities of poverty often stripped away such careful protections for other young women. This brings us to working-class realities, less protected ignorance. Imagine you, a young woman from a poorer family living in a crowded urban slum. Your life is dictated by the grind of survival, and the polite fictions of purity and delicate sensibilities are often luxuries your circumstances simply cannot afford. You see, for working-class girls, the strict segregation of sexes and the prolonged period of childhood innocence were often impractical. Many began working at a very young age in factories, mills, or as domestic servants in other people's homes. These environments exposed them to a much wider range of social interactions, language, and the grittier realities of life. They might witness older co-workers discussing sexual matters, observe unmarried couples living together, or be exposed to the pervasive presence of prostitution in their neighborhoods. While they might still receive moralistic warnings from their mothers, The sheer practicalities of their lives and the lack of protected private spaces often meant their ignorance was less complete than that of their wealthier counterparts. This mainstream historical fact, the greater exposure of working-class girls to sexual realities due to their living and working conditions, created a significant class divide in what young women knew about sex. Historians still argue whether this greater exposure actually led to a more pragmatic or realistic understanding of sex among working-class women, or if it simply meant they encountered sexual knowledge in more brutal and less supportive contexts. It's a bit like learning about the ocean by being thrown into the deep end. You might learn to swim, but it's a terrifying experience without guidance. You might hear crude jokes, witness overt flirtations, or see the tragic consequences of unprotected sex firsthand, forcing a premature awareness of realities that middle-class girls were carefully shielded from. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some working-class girls might even have been subjected to sexual harassment or assault in their workplaces or crowded living conditions, further shattering any illusion of innocence and forcing a harsh, unwelcome education. Imagine a young girl, perhaps just 12 or 14, navigating a factory floor filled with dangers, both mechanical and human, where the polite rules of separate spheres simply didn't apply. The quiet desperation of their lives, the lack of private spaces and constant supervision, meant that their ignorance about sex was often a fragile thing, easily broken by the pressures and exposures of daily survival. This stark contrast highlights how deeply class shaped a young Victorian woman's knowledge, or lack thereof, regarding the most intimate aspects of life. While direct conversations were censored and harsh realities often confronted working-class girls, another subtle yet pervasive source of information existed, one that allowed for a kind of vicarious learning about forbidden topics. This brings us to literature's coded messages. Imagine you, a young Victorian woman, devouring a popular novel or a volume of poetry in the quiet solitude of your room. Beneath the surface of romance and melodrama, you might encounter veiled hints, tragic consequences, or subtle allusions that, if you were clever enough, offered a glimpse into the unspoken realities of sex and its repercussions. You see, while explicit content was strictly forbidden in mainstream Victorian literature, authors often explored themes of illicit love, seduction, moral transgression, and their dire consequences through carefully coded language and plot devices. A character might lose her bloom, fall from grace, or face a shameful secret. A woman's sudden illness, a secluded retreat, or a mysterious absence could subtly imply an out-of-wedlock pregnancy. These narratives, while serving as moral cautionary tales, inadvertently offered young readers a form of sex education by demonstrating the societal repercussions of sexual activity outside marriage. This mainstream historical fact, the use of veiled language and narrative consequences in Victorian literature to convey truths about sex, was a common, albeit indirect, source of knowledge for young women. Historians still argue whether these coded messages primarily reinforced societal anxieties about female sexuality and control, or if they also provided a clandestine space for young women to grapple with concepts they couldn't discuss openly. It's a bit like a secret language shared between author and reader. The words are innocent, but the meaning is clear to those who understand the code. You might pore over a passage describing a character's sudden decline, or her desperate efforts to hide a secret, piecing together the unspoken implications and drawing conclusions about the dangers of deviation from the path of virtue. Here's a quirky tidbit. The very act of reading novels was sometimes frowned upon for young women, precisely because it was feared they might encounter these dangerous themes and have their imagination stimulated in inappropriate ways. Imagine a mother confiscating a copy of East Lynne, not because of its melodramatic plot, but because its tale of a woman's fall might spark too many uncomfortable questions. The quiet power of these literary hints, the way they allowed young women to glimpse the forbidden world of sexual consequences without ever explicitly naming it, meant that literature, for all its supposed innocence, often served as a surprisingly potent, albeit indirect, source of knowledge about the dangers and realities of sex in Victorian society. Beyond the formal and literary avenues, young Victorian women, like young people in any era, found ways to exchange information outside the purview of adults, often through hushed tones and shared assumptions. This brings us to peer-to-peer whispers, informal information exchange. Imagine you, a young woman, gathered with your closest friends or sisters, perhaps in a secluded corner of a garden or in the privacy of a bedroom. Here, free from the watchful eyes of chaperones and parents, you might finally hear fragments of what you truly longed to know, though often distorted by rumor and limited understanding. You see, despite the pervasive silence and the careful shielding, by adults complete ignorance about sex was virtually impossible. Young women, driven by natural curiosity and the imminent prospect of marriage, would inevitably piece together information from their peers. This could involve whispered conversations about the differences between male and female bodies, crude jokes overheard from servants, or confused attempts to interpret the veiled warnings given by mothers. They might speculate about the wedding night, the process of having babies, or the precise nature of the duties a wife performed. This mainstream historical fact, the significant role of informal peer-to-peer communication in transmitting fragmented sexual knowledge, was often the most direct, albeit unreliable source of information for young Victorian women. Historians still argue whether this reliance on informal peer knowledge primarily fostered misinformation and anxiety, or if it also created a crucial space for young women to collectively grapple with bewildering concepts and build a shared understanding. It's a bit like trying to assemble a complex puzzle with half the pieces missing and no picture on the box. You might get some parts right, but the overall image will be incomplete and perhaps warped. You might contribute your own snippets of overheard conversation or misinterpreted advice, desperately trying to construct a coherent picture of what awaited you in marriage. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes, these whispered conversations would involve girls examining anatomical diagrams found in hidden medical books, perhaps borrowed from a male relative, or even sketching rudimentary, inaccurate drawings of the human body in secret, attempting to demystify its forbidden aspects. Imagine furtively passing around a dog-eared medical illustration, trying to make sense of the mysterious organs depicted within. The quiet conspiracy of these whispered exchanges, the shared attempts to decode the world of adult sexuality, meant that young women were never entirely ignorant, but their knowledge was often a patchwork of half-truths, anxieties, and fanciful imaginings, a far cry from comprehensive understanding. This informal network, for all its limitations, provided a vital, if flawed, lifeline of information in a world designed to keep them in the dark. As the wedding day approached and the prospect of marital intimacy became undeniable, some young women, particularly those from more educated backgrounds, might turn to another source, albeit one filtered through a very specific lens: marriage manuals, clinical and duty-bound. Imagine you, a prospective bride, discreetly acquiring or being given a small, unassuming book, perhaps titled something like The Married Lady's Guide or Advice to a Young Wife. You open its pages, hoping for practical insights, only to find descriptions of conjugal duties framed in clinical, often passionless, and distinctly moralistic terms. You see, while explicit descriptions of sex were absent from public discourse, a growing number of marriage manuals emerged in the Victorian era, aimed at instructing newlywed couples, particularly wives, on their conjugal responsibilities. These books, often written by male physicians or moralists, rarely discussed sexual pleasure, especially for women. Instead, they focused on the reproductive purpose of intercourse, the importance of mutual affection within the marriage, not necessarily passion, and the wife's duty to submit to her husband's desires for the sake of procreation and domestic harmony. Descriptions of the act itself were highly euphemistic and clinical, often describing it as a marital obligation or a sacred privilege. This mainstream historical fact, the existence of marriage manuals that provided a clinical and duty-focused, rather than passionate or pleasure-oriented, guide to conjugal relations, was one of the few formal literary sources a young woman might encounter on the topic. Historians still argue whether these manuals, for all their limitations, provided a necessary, if minimal, form of preparation for the wedding night, or if they ultimately fostered a sense of dread and obligation rather than mutual understanding and enjoyment. It's a bit like being given an instruction manual for a complex machine, but the manual only tells you how to turn it on and off, never how to truly operate it or appreciate its full capabilities. You might read these passages with a mixture of trepidation and curiosity, trying to decipher the precise nature of these duties and wondering about the mysterious physical acts alluded to. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some manuals even contained advice on how often marital relations should occur, sometimes correlating it with a man's health or the desire for children, turning intimacy into a scheduled event rather than a spontaneous expression of affection. Imagine your future intimate life being dictated by a recommended frequency from a book, almost like a medical prescription. The quiet, cold tone of these manuals, the emphasis on duty and decorum over desire, meant that any specific education a young woman received from them was rooted in obligation and procreation, leaving the emotional and pleasurable aspects of sexuality largely unaddressed and still shrouded in mystery. Beyond the sheltered parlors and hushed conversations, the rigid moral code of Victorian society often created a stark, visible counterpoint to the ideal of female purity. This brings us to prostitution's shadow, a visible taboo. Imagine you, a young Victorian woman, walking through the bustling streets of London or Manchester. Amidst the respectable crowds, you might glimpse women whose elaborate clothing, bold demeanor, or perhaps just their unfortunate presence in certain districts, subtly signaled a life outside the bounds of conventional morality. These were the unfortunates, the fallen women, and their existence, though fiercely condemned, served as a grim, undeniable and often tragic lesson in the consequences of illicit sexuality. You see, despite the pervasive emphasis on female purity, prostitution was a widespread and highly visible phenomenon in Victorian cities, a dark underbelly to the era's strict sexual morality. While respectable young women were taught absolute ignorance and modesty, the presence of prostitutes, whether discreetly encountered or explicitly warned against, provided a stark, albeit disturbing, education about the realities of forbidden sex. Their existence highlighted the immense social double standard. Men's sexual urges were often excused or seen as natural, while female sexuality outside of marriage was condemned and punished with social ruin. The public health campaigns against venereal disease, which often targeted prostitutes, also inadvertently provided veiled information about the physical consequences of illicit encounters. This mainstream historical fact, the visible yet taboo presence of prostitution, offered young Victorian women a powerful, if indirect, lesson in the societal dangers of unregulated female sexuality. Historians still argue whether the widespread existence of prostitution was primarily a symptom of male sexual hypocrisy and economic desperation among women, or if it also served as a necessary evil that paradoxically helped maintain the purity of respectable women by providing an outlet for male sexual urges. It's a bit like a pressure valve on a steam engine. You might hate the noise and the wasted steam, but it prevents the whole thing from exploding. You might find yourself quickly averting your gaze, perhaps feeling a mixture of pity and fear as you pass these women, internalizing the chilling lesson that their fate was the ultimate consequence of falling. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some philanthropists and moral reformers would patrol certain districts, attempting to rescue fallen women and rehabilitate them through strict religious and vocational training in institutions often called Magdalene asylums. Imagine being approached on the street by a stern woman offering you redemption and a life of domestic servitude. The quiet shame associated with these unfortunates, the way their very existence served as a constant moral warning, meant that, even without explicit details, young Victorian women absorbed a profound understanding of the devastating social repercussions of sexual transgression. Prostitution, therefore, cast a long, dark shadow, revealing a stark truth about sex and its consequences that no amount of prudishness could completely conceal. While young Victorian women were carefully shielded and subtly warned, their male counterparts often received a very different and frequently contradictory form of education about sex. This brings us to male education and double standards. Imagine you, a young Victorian man coming of age in this era. While your sisters are taught purity and ignorance, you are likely to encounter a world where male sexual urges are acknowledged, even excused, and where a different set of rules, often unwritten, governs your path to adulthood. You see, Victorian society operated on a profound sexual double standard. While female chastity was paramount and rigorously enforced, male sexual activity, particularly before marriage, was often tolerated or even seen as a natural expression of male virility, provided it was discreet and did not involve respectable women. Young men might receive warnings about the dangers of venereal disease or the moral perils of excess, but rarely were they taught absolute abstinence or the same degree of sexual ignorance expected of women. Their education might come from older male relatives, schoolmates, bawdy jokes, or visits to brothels, as we touched upon in the previous section. This mainstream historical fact, the starkly different and often contradictory sexual education and expectations for young men compared to young women, created a fundamental asymmetry in their understanding of sex. Historians still argue whether this double standard was primarily a reflection of innate biological differences perceived at the time, or if it was a patriarchal construct designed to maintain male power and control over female sexuality. It's a bit like having two different sets of rules for a game, one for each team. It might make sense to the dominant team, but it creates an uneven playing field. You might, as a young man, feel a quiet tension between the public pronouncements of morality and the private realities of male locker room talk, perhaps even feeling pressure to engage in experiences that would be utterly ruinous for a woman. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some fathers, despite upholding strict moral codes for their daughters, might discreetly arrange for their sons to visit a prostitute before marriage, believing it was a necessary rite of passage or a way to get it out of their system without corrupting a future wife. Imagine the hypocrisy, the silent complicity in a system that simultaneously condemned and enabled illicit male sexuality. The quiet assumptions of male desire, the unspoken tolerance for certain transgressions, meant that young men entered marriage with a far greater, albeit often warped, understanding of sex, while their future wives remained in a state of carefully cultivated innocence. This stark divergence in education created a profound chasm of knowledge between men and women, setting the stage for potentially shocking and bewildering wedding nights. As our journey through the shrouded world of what young Victorian women knew about sex draws to a close, we are left with a complex understanding of a society grappling with profound contradictions. This brings us to the legacy of Victorian prudishness, its lasting impact on modern attitudes. Imagine looking at our contemporary society where sex is openly discussed, depicted, and often celebrated. Yet, can you still feel the subtle echoes, the faint whispers of Victorian discomfort, lingering beneath the surface of our own openness? You see, the extreme prudishness and sexual repression of the Victorian era, while seemingly a relic of the past, cast a long shadow over subsequent generations. Many of our modern anxieties about sex, our discomfort with certain topics, or even the lingering double standards can be traced back to these Victorian attitudes. The idea of sex as primarily for procreation, the emphasis on female purity, even if redefined, the discomfort with open discussions about the body, and the shame associated with sexual deviance, all these concepts, to varying degrees, seeped into the 20th century and beyond. While we have made immense strides in sexual liberation and education, the deep-seated cultural conditioning of the Victorian period continues to influence our collective psyche. This mainstream historical fact, the enduring legacy of Victorian sexual attitudes on modern Western society, highlights how deeply historical norms can shape contemporary thought. Historians still argue whether the Victorian era's extreme repression ultimately led to a more explosive sexual revolution in the 20th century as a pendulum swing, or if it simply ingrained a persistent discomfort with sexuality that continues to manifest in new ways. It's a bit like pressing down on a spring. The harder you press, the more forcefully it recoils when released. You might find yourself, in a moment of modern openness, suddenly feeling a twinge of inherited awkwardness, a quiet echo of the Victorian past that reminds you just how deeply ingrained these attitudes once were. Here's a quirky tidbit to carry with you as we drift off. Even seemingly innocuous terms like Victorian itself became synonymous with prudishness, stiffness, and sexual repression in popular culture, creating a shorthand for an entire era's complex relationship with intimacy. Imagine an entire historical period being reduced to a single adjective describing discomfort with sexuality. The quiet, pervasive influence of Victorian morality meant that even as societies evolved, the ghost of their sexual reticence continued to whisper through the generations, shaping unspoken norms and lingering anxieties. Their profound attempt to control and conceal knowledge about sex, however well-intentioned or oppressive it may have been, ultimately underscores the enduring human struggle to understand, regulate, and express one's most fundamental urges. The legacy of Victorian prudishness is not just about what young women didn't know. It's about the very landscape of knowledge, secrecy, and societal control that continues to inform our conversations about sex, even today. As the gaslights dim and the hum of the city outside fades, you can almost hear the rustle of a stiff crinoline, the hushed tones of a mother's vague warnings, and the unasked questions lingering in a young woman's mind. Let the anxieties of a bygone era, the strictures and the unspoken truths, gently recede now. The history, the knowledge, the quiet insights into how society grappled with intimacy now drifts away on the soft currents of your breath. Allow yourself to loosen your grip on the day's thoughts, letting them soften and blur. The whispers of the past are becoming fainter, merging with the calm, steady rhythm of your own heart. All the complexities, all the worries, all the curious details, they are simply sounds now, fading into the comfortable quiet. Just listen to the soft hush, feel the peaceful stillness surrounding you, and let your mind unwind. Sweet dreams.